Act 3, Scene 4 is the important banquet scene, a topic which is important as a long question for the university examination, and this scene also contains very important lines and also works as an important transition point in the life and the future of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and also the future of Scotland. In Act 3, Scene 4, which takes place in the banquet hall in the palace of Scotland, Macbeth invites his guests to sit according to their degrees or their ranks, so that they may all welcome Macbeth officially into the position of the king. It's important to understand the meaning of the word banquet and the concept of the banquet, both in the context of the play as well as in the context in which the Elizabethan audience understood it. First, for the Elizabethan audience, the word banquet would have a Christian connotation referring to the feast in which Jesus was invited and had a feast with his disciples. This feast also refers to, and the details of this Christian connotation and its references from the Bible are displayed in this in the screen, referred to as the parable of the great feast. Nextly, it's also important to associate this feast in the banquet with the Last Supper, which Jesus shared with his disciples, and where he was heartily sharing a feast with his closest disciple, Judas, who later betrayed him. So there is, in the reference to the Last Supper, and there's an allusion to both friendship which turns into enmity and friendship which is disguised as enmity. Of course, a very ironical reference to the friendship and enmity conflict which Macbeth and Banquo share. Before the other courtiers, Macbeth talks about Banquo as if he was the best of his friends, whom he expects to join the banquet very soon, while all the time knowing that he is the person who has ordered Banquo to be murdered. It's also important to understand that the banquet not only works as a Christian allusion in this text, but also as a political allusion, because it is in this formal feast that the formal coronation and the formal acceptance of Macbeth amongst the people and the courtiers of Scotland will take place. Therefore, it's very important that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth present themselves most officiously and most properly in the course of this whole event. However, if this event requires an official propriety, it is this event which turns completely chaotic. If this scene requires a stability, a steadfastness on the part of the hosts, then this scene actually turns into complete anarchy by the end, which indicates that this is exactly going to be the future of Scotland from here on. Scotland will expect a stable rule under the kingship of Macbeth, but what they will get is complete anarchy and complete chaos and an overturning of the established order. So subversion is one of the key themes of this scene, as it is for the whole of the play. Macbeth, ourself will mingle with society and play the humble host. These are all of his expectations, and it is when he's talking about intermingling with his courtiers and acting so properly with them that the murderer appears, and he says to them, "There's blood on thy face." First murderer, "It is Banquo's then, Macbeth. It is better thee without than he within. Is he dispatched? My lord, his throat is cut. I did that for him. Macbeth, thou art the best of the cutthroats. That is good, that did the life of Fleance. If thou didst it, thou art the nonpareil. Most royal sir, Fleance is escaped. Then comes my fit again, I else had been perfect. So here, from the information that the murderer gives, is the beginning of how the wholesomeness, how the composed nature of Macbeth completely disappears, and there comes the fit again, and he was stable and steadfast as a rock, as a marble, and now he is completely cabined, cribbed, and confined. Then the murderer leaves after giving this information, and of course we do remember that this is whole discussion and the action which Macbeth had shared with the murderers, and he had not made Lady Macbeth a party to all of this information. And therefore, Lady Macbeth says, "You do not give the cheer the feast is sold, that it is not often vouched, while 'tis a making, 'tis given with a welcome." So Lady Macbeth realizes that Macbeth's attitude has changed somewhat. He is not cheerful anymore. He is not welcoming anymore. And of course, Macbeth does not reveal anything about his discussions about Banquo's murder and Fleance's escape, but continues to pretend. It is at this moment that Macbeth starts to pretend that the ghost of Banquo enters and sits in Macbeth's place. It's important to consider here, to pause for a moment and consider the position of the ghost here. Of course, as far as the context of the play is concerned, the ghost of the ghost of Banquo unseats Macbeth, which means that here the ghostly presence of Banquo unseats or takes away the actual physical presence of Macbeth. So from a scene where we expect that Macbeth is going to officially gain a seat, gain a position of kingship, we see the beginning of his unseating. Secondly, it's important to understand that the ghost of Banquo is seen only by Macbeth. We'll read a bit to understand this context. Here, he's talking about how his country's honor is great, and it's housed in this palace itself, where all of the honorable members of the kingdom are present, and where he also expects Banquo to be present. And then Ross talks about Banquo's absence, and Macbeth says that the table's full. And Lennox says that there is still a place reserved for Macbeth, and Macbeth does not find his own place. And then he says that thou canst not say, "I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me." These words, we must note, are not directed either to Ross or Lennox, but they are directed towards Banquo, or if you like, the ghostly presence of Banquo, for which for Macbeth is very literal. Therefore, we understand that Banquo appears very literal before Macbeth, and no one else can see him. So Banquo's ghostly presence encompasses both sight, one of the people in the room can see him, and lack of sight. That's most of the others cannot see him. Which is to say that we may state that Banquo's ghost both exists and does not exist. It is the position of Banquo's ghost, therefore, comes very close to the other supernatural hallucinations in this play, that is the dagger, or the dagger which we have already discussed, and about the apparitions about whom we'll discuss a little later. So the role of the supernatural in the Elizabethan world, one of whose very important symbolic representation is the ghost of Banquo, is that it's both traditional, in that it states that these supernatural imaginings are real. Of course, we must again cross-refer to King James's works on witchcraft and demonology, which people in his kingdom read, in which they believed. And then, of course, the very modernist mindset of the Elizabethan audience, for whom all of these supernatural imaginings were only imaginings and no more. Then, to move on, Lady Macbeth here plays a role where she comes out as more steadfast, as someone who almost tries to cover what Macbeth is really destroying for himself, and she says that the fit is momentary. Upon a thought he will again be well, if much you note him. So he's covering up. She's covering up for her husband, whilst Macbeth continues to parallelly speak to the ghost of Banquo. So in this scene, we must, if we are making a note of the structural progression of the play, we must note that the speeches of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth move in parallel directions. Lady Macbeth talking to the rest of the courtiers, while Macbeth is talking to Banquo. So here it's almost as if the court of Scotland is divided into natural and supernatural beings. And then Lady Macbeth talks to her husband that he's appearing very fearful and almost like a woman who is so much afraid of the ghost stories that's being told to her, and he's behaving like a little child and imagining an imaginary dagger. And of course, the way in which Macbeth responds to her, if thou canst not speak too, if first of all, he doesn't directly respond to her at all, which is to say that Macbeth, from this point, and this scene, and especially these lines, this position in the scene, makes it very clear that Macbeth is no more responding to anything to which Lady Macbeth is trying to move him towards. So he's becoming completely separated, both physically as well as mentally, from his wife. And the way in which he speaks to the supernatural, again, these images are very important. If charnel houses and our graves must send those we bury back, our monuments shall be the maws of kites. He's referring to very dark images of the underworld, the charnel houses, or the houses of the dead, and the maws of kites, these birds who fly over dead bodies. And he's talking about graves where the dead rest, and he's talking about bringing the dead back, which of course he feels that Banquo is really risen from the dead. So here, of course, the rising of Banquo again from the dead could be compared to the resurrection of Christ, resurrection of Jesus to become the Christ figure, that is. But it's important that despite this continuous Christian allusions in the scope of the play, Macbeth is parallelly using Christian symbolism as well as dark images of the world, of the underworld, parallelly. So a Christian symbolism and netherworld existence is almost in conflict in Macbeth's being, and Shakespeare here brings that Christian world and the netherworld so much close in the being and the existence of Macbeth. And it's important to understand that the extreme, the excruciating conflict that Macbeth goes through when these two exactly opposite worlds, the world of the heaven and the world of the hell, almost clash within him, And Macbeth then continues to talk about murder and bloodshed, that blood had been shed here now in the olden time, here humans, before human statute purged the gentle wheel. And again he talks about murders and 20 mortal murders on their crowns and push us from our stools. This is more strange than such a murder is. So he's saying that if murder is something which is committed, then the result of the murder which is here is standing before him is so gruesome that he feels as if he has committed 20 murders. Of course, it's important to note that here Macbeth is revealing that he has committed something like a murder, and people become really surprised, and which is one of the reasons that Lady Macbeth calls this banquet to a halt and tells all the courtiers to really go away, not following any rank, any propriety, but just to leave in any manner that they want, which is to say that this banquet ends in complete instability and complete disorder, where it was really expected to establish a new kind of order. But it's also important to understand that for Lady Macbeth, the revelation of this murder on the part of her husband, not clear, but in terms of certain images, is really something when she begins to realize that her husband is not really sharing much with her. Therefore, after this scene, we do not see much of Lady Macbeth. Of course, there are small instances where we see Lady Macbeth discussing with her husband, but very short scenes, after which she completely isolates herself, and finally we see her at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 1, in the sleepwalking scene, which is really a result of her of the conflict of the love that she shared with her husband and the estrangement which was almost forced upon her. But to come back to the kind of images that Macbeth uses while defining murder, it's really a world of extreme dark and extreme images from the world of the dead that he's using, which really brings Macbeth's speeches and the kind of words and images that he uses very close to the words and speeches of Hecate, the mother of the witches, and the kind of images and words she conjures in the making of the brew in the cauldron, where she brings in different parts of animals and boils them and makes this gruesome broth for humankind. And then this speech by Macbeth, where he says, "I do forget, do not muse at me, my most worthy friends. I have a strange infirmity." For a short while, he really comes back from his parallel speeches with Banquo's ghost and addresses his courtiers. Again, a very short instance where he displays being the host, and I drink to the general joy of the whole table and to our dear friend Banquo. Again, his short part at pretending, his short act at pretending. And again, he begins addressing Banquo's ghost. "Avaunt and quit my sight, let the earth hide thee, thy bones are marrowless, the blood is cold." And it's important that the immense transitions through which Macbeth's speeches move, one of a calm, composed response to the actions to the courtiers, and drinking to the general joy and the calmness and the peace and the stability, and on the other hand invoking really gruesome and violent images of dead bodies, of pale dead bodies, and blood turned cold in the act of murder. Which is to say that it is these two extreme kinds of images which are extreme, and it is these two extreme kinds of existence which is living in the mind and in the being of Macbeth, and it's almost tearing him apart. And it is in this way that Macbeth's fragmentation is really dramatized at in its most brilliant in a most brilliant way in this scene. And when Lady Macbeth says that you are really spoiling the pleasure of the time and you are really becoming afraid, you're very frightened. Then Macbeth says, "What man dare? I dare." Again, bringing back to us the images of manhood and what a man can do. And then the ghost of Banquo vanishes. That is for Macbeth, who had actually seen it. And he says that I am a man again. So really, when one encounters the netherworld, when one begins to behave and invoke images of the netherworld, then one really does not remain a man. In fact, one does not really remain a human being. One needs to be made more than a human being. It's the same for Macbeth, and it's also the same, if we remember, for Lady Macbeth, who for normal actions of the world could be a woman, but to commit and calmly plan a murder, she needed to be quote-unquote unsexed by evil spirits. And Macbeth continues. Lady Macbeth really sums up what the banquet scene has actually resulted in. You have displaced the mirth, broke the good meeting with most admired disorder. So the banquet, which was really which was organized to establish order, had ended in complete disorder. And Lady Macbeth, since she's not party to the conflict that Macbeth right now is undergoing, says with complete irony and sarcasm that it's an admired disorder, which means that Macbeth really had no reason to act like this, but of course he did. And then all the other courtiers leave except Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and this is short interaction between the husband and the wife, again important to show the way in which Macbeth's conflicts are developing in a completely different way than that of Lady Macbeth, and about which Lady Macbeth has really no idea. Macbeth says, "For mine own good all causes shall give way. I am in blood steeped in so far." These lines where he's talking about being steeped in blood, that if he should move, if he should decide to not move forward anymore, it would be, and returning would be as tedious as going over. Strange things I have heard that will to hand, which must be acted ere they may be scanned. These lines of being steeped so much in the river of blood that to decide to return is so much more difficult than moving forward, is really Shakespeare's really a brilliant imagistic way to say that from this point onwards, Macbeth will go on committing more and more crimes, more and more villainies, which he really wouldn't be ready to scan or to introspect anymore. Actions from henceforth will only be committed without any kind of guilty introspection, because they will ultimately result in a kind of an extreme excruciating self-analysis, which will bring out so much of the darkness that is residing within him, that kind of extreme darkness which we witnessed in the kind of images that he was using when he was talking to the ghost of Banquo. So this dark netherworld of Macbeth's subconscious is being completely repressed. At least Macbeth is taking that decision to completely repress that and go on committing villainies without really thinking twice about it. And this is how the scene ends. If Act 3, Scene 4 talked about the horrors within Macbeth, Act 3, Scene 5, which takes place in the heath and which is presided over by the three witches meeting Hecate, that is the fourth witch in the play, is a scene which represents the horrors without, that is outside Macbeth. And in this scene, therefore, it's important to understand the images which the world of the witches contrive and really find a similarity with the kind of images used by Macbeth. The reason why I make this relation at all is because in Hecate's speech, her the relationship of the world of the witches and the world of Macbeth is really stated very clearly. How did you dare to trade and traffic with Macbeth in riddles and affairs of death? And I, the mistress of your charms, the close contriver of all harms, was never called to bear my part, or show the glory of our art. Here, really, Hecate is angry that the three witches have conversed with Macbeth and talked in an equivocating manner about his future, whilst Hecate really had no part to play in it, because after all she's the main contriver of all their actions and their words, and she really didn't have a part to play in it. And the way in which she continues to use a number of images about the dismal and the fatal end and the vaporous drop, the profound vaporous drop, the magic slides, the artificial sprites, the illusion, the confusion, the wisdom, the till confusion. All of these words really describe the illusion, the confusion, and the artificial sprite and the magical nature. All of these words importantly describe the supernatural atmosphere of the world of the witches. And it's important to understand that what Hecate says whilst referring to these words is really a kind of a confusion that the world of the witches represent to us. And it's also important to remember that this is confusion because we as human beings are not really used to living in that world, and we really therefore do not understand its meanings. Any world in which we do not live, any world whose words we are not accustomed to, are words of confusion and words of illusion. And therefore Shakespeare makes clear that the only difference between the world of the natural and the supernatural lies in the small difference between knowledge and lack of knowledge, between reality and delusion, between order and confusion. This really small gap between these two things, which we saw in the banquet scene just preceding this scene, and of course in many other scenes before this so small space between what is fair and what is foul. The next scene, scene 6, is taking place in the palace at Force, where Lennox and another lord enters, and Lennox says, "My former speeches have but hit your thoughts, which can interpret further. Only I say things have been strangely born." The continuation from scene 5 to scene 6, at least even from scene 4 to 5 to scene 6, the use of the word strange and the use of the word artificial and the use of the word strangely born, it really connects these scenes and establishes really a new meaning of order and kingship. When we are discussing about kingship in Macbeth, it's important to discuss about what kind of kingship Shakespeare is representing to us. It's kingship which is both order and disorder at the same time, which is both realistic and strange at the same time. And then Lennox continues, "The gracious Duncan was pitied of Macbeth. Marry, he was dead, and the right valiant Banquo walked too late, whom we may say, if it please you, Fleance killed, for Fleance fled." Men must not walk too late. This line again very important. Men really must not walk too late, really must not encounter or put themselves so much close to the world of the darkness, because really an overwhelming darkness is engulfing Scotland, and people should be extremely careful to stay away from it. Who cannot want the thought of how monstrous it was for Malcolm and for Donalbain to kill their gracious father? Here again a very clear indication to an act of patricide, that is Malcolm and Donalbain killing their gracious father. But of course we must understand that Shakespeare is here questioning patricide itself, because here of course he's very clearly putting a question mark, and we do know as the audience that for Shakespeare and for the Elizabethan, for the audience who are witnessing the play, there are many doubts that Malcolm and Donalbain didn't kill their father. So if Shakespeare is talking about patricide in this play, he is also talking about a number of constructions upon which the idea of patricide is based, and a false lament which is associated with patricide. And how did it grieve Macbeth? Because after the murder of Duncan, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth appeared extremely grief-stricken, so much grief-stricken that it was really something which put a lot of doubt in their in the very nature of the extremity of their actions. And the fact Lennox is also discussing how Macbeth in pious rage killed the two guards who were apparently believed to have committed the murder, on the words of Malcolm and Donalbain. And then he continues, he has borne all things well, and I do think that had he Duncan's sons under his key, and it please heaven he shall not, they should find what it were to kill a father, so should Fleance. So if this one of the contrived acts of patricide is the way in which Malcolm and Donalbain are blamed for the murder of their father, King Duncan, there is the second act of contrived patricide in this play, where Fleance is blamed for the murder of his father, Banquo. It's important to remember that from this act of contrived patricide, Shakespeare begins the origin of new rule. Because just after this play, Malcolm will become the King of Scotland, and later in the future, it's the successors, it's Fleance and the successors of Fleance who will rule over Scotland. So patricide, if it is contrived, if it's false, really is something from which a new truth begins, the new truth of legitimate kingship and legitimate succession. And then the other lord, very importantly, gives a number of information, the son of Duncan, from whom this tyrant holds. So just it's been really not much time since Macbeth had hosted a banquet in his castle, and now he's being termed as the tyrant. So he must have committed really a number of villainies. He must have steeped very much into that river of blood for people to really understand him so quickly as a tyrant. And then this lord gives information that Malcolm lives in the English court and is received as the most pious Edward. Of course, here we must compare and contrast, very importantly, the tyrant Macbeth and the pious English king Edward, who has the ability to heal, and Macbeth really kills everything that is healing and that is wholesome. And then this lord also talks about the help which the lords and the King of England have decided to help Malcolm with. And then he continues that all of this is being done to bring about stability and peace in Scotland again, so that we may again give to our tables meat, sleep to our nights, free our feasts and banquets, bloody knives, do faithful homage and receive free honours, all which we pine for now. So the kind of extreme conflict that Macbeth himself was undergoing, his inability or lack of ability to have food in his kingdom, food on his table, and his banquet without a bloody knife, and a sleep in his night, it's also something which is affecting the whole of his kingdom. Again, that relationship between the microcosm, the conflicts which affect the individual, and the macrocosm, that is the conflicts which affect the universe, really working in a parallel direction. Whatever conflicts Macbeth faces, similar number of conflicts, similar kinds of conflicts the people in his kingdom will face. And then the final speech by Lennox, all that well might advise him to a caution to hold what distance his wisdom can provide, talking about Macduff, that Macbeth has displayed a lot of distrust about Macduff and his not being present in the banquet. So the other courtiers are really afraid that Macbeth has now decided to kill Macduff, and therefore Lennox says that all right, well, advise him to a caution to hold what distance his wisdom can provide. Some holy angel fly to the court of England and unfold his message. Here he come, that a swift blessing may soon return to this our suffering country under a land accursed. Two very important information and in this last passage by Lennox. One, that Macduff has pledged to England and only his family remains, and therefore he should be notified about the impending disaster which is about to befall him, that is Macduff. And secondly, that the whole of the country is suffering under the cursed rule of Macbeth. It's important that to understand that the people see Macbeth not only as a tyrant or a political dictator, but also as a cursed human being. That is someone who's committed sacrilege. So it's from this point of view that we understand that Macbeth's actions, Macbeth's position is subverted both from a religious as well as from a secular point of view and a premise.